And I'm going to see if I can share. Wait a minute. Which screen can you see?
I see lots of flowers.
Okay, perfect. All right. So does anyone have questions to start out with? Hannah?
Everyone's just looking at me. Let's see. I'll start with a good question. Any particular things that you've learned over the years that you wish you would have known or learned earlier and that you would like other people to know?
Yeah, for game development in general, actually app development in general, is create thumbnails. Figure out how to take pretty much any project that you're on and create a thumbnail from it. I remember when I was first starting out, the idea of a resume being overwhelming. What did I have to draw from that I could actually build a resume and show it? Because like the first time going out for a job, it's like, okay, well, yeah, I went to high school and I've played with computers personally, but I have not actually worked for a business doing this thing that I'm trying to get a position for. But there's so much more than that. I mean, especially when you're coming out of college, then it makes a lot of sense that you've got college. You can put college on your resume. You were studying and focusing on these things. So you've got a little bit to build up, but that's still pretty small in comparison or to how you feel like you should, what kind of experience you should have. And I just remember being overwhelmed by that personally. And it took me years to start figuring it out. But once I started becoming a senior developer, I started realizing that, and I was the one interviewing people and looking at resumes. I started realizing that all those little things in the background, that it's like there were thousands of things that I did while I was in high school, just messing around with computers, that might have potentially made good notches on my resume. Even if it didn't have like a company paying me to do it, it was still real experience. So any of your projects that you're doing for school, any of the little things that you're trying to do on your own, if you join a game jam, biggest thing is focus on just what you can create, a small notch that you can present quickly. Especially if you can do animated GIFs. That's a great way to do it, because you can showcase, here was this effect that I added. Here was the way this character was moving. Here was how these items interacted. I would say that's probably one of the biggest things. And you can start building a huge amount of a resume off of it. Plus, when you get farther into your career, it's really awesome to be able to call back and say, oh yeah, in 2011, I actually started playing around with this technology. And you've got kind of a footprint saying, yeah, for all the way back, like over a decade, I started messing around with that stuff. My first position in it was in 2022, where I was being paid for it, but I personally started working on it over a decade before then. And a lot of us might have things where we're doing that. One of the things that I would also say is game testing. Like game testing is one of the places where you can kind of jump into a game development career, for instance, or testing in general for app development. But you start getting into the testing, into the development. And I kind of forgot where I was going with that one. So I'm going to leave that one. We can move on to another question. Or feel free to ask follow-up questions on these as well. They don't just need to be one question, one answer.
Actually, I'm glad that you brought up game testing, because we have had some interest in like unit testing and things like that. So I think there'd be we could figure out how to continue that answer in the future, and figure out how to integrate testing with game development to really kind of give a well-rounded approach to all of that. That would be great. We can continue this later past the lecture, and then I can bring it back.
All right. Oh, I was going to bring up one thing with that you just reminded me of. So for getting into testing positions, that is an excellent gateway position. Like if you're first out of college, you're having trouble finding places to go work, and you're looking for anything to start getting paid. uh, game testing is a great gateway where you start getting in, and you will generally have regular connection with the developers, with other testers, with designers, who are wanting you to test and validate features of their game. And depending on what type of things you come back with, um, you very quickly start developing your network with all of these different positions and places. Um, and that is a great place to start out at. I would also, well, yeah, whatever. I'll answer. I'll go on to more questions. I could monologue for an hour or 10.
That actually leads into a second question I had. So I did look at like a game testing position recently. But the way that the position was posted and the posting was worded was pretty aggressive. They were very keen on you. If you wanted to be a tester, then you needed to know how to play video games. Like you needed to be like the best video game player, because they didn't want someone with a mediocre like level of gameplay knowledge to be testing their games, is basically the way that they worded it. And I was wondering if that was something that was shared across that area. Like, do you have to be good at playing video games? Like, is that like a requirement?
You don't have to be like a die-hard player where it's like you get a game, you spend like 50, $70 or something, and you get a new game for the Xbox or PlayStation. And then you spend like 8 hours on it and you're done with the whole thing because you've beaten it. They don't expect, most positions like that are not going to expect like super game players. In fact, one of the biggest areas of testability for games, especially if you're talking about like online games or mobile games systems where the games generally update continuously throughout their lifetime, it's actually the exact opposite. They want people who are going to be testing the beginnings a lot. They want people who are going to be diving into the game. Now, granted, I would definitely agree there are going to be positions where they want someone who very clearly can jump in and just, they're kind of an expert in this type of game. And it'll usually be based on genres. So we want someone who is an expert in racing games. If you're talking about like Forza, for instance, Forza has incredibly realistic systems. And if you turn off the hand holding that it has, because it has a lot of AI systems kind of supporting your driving, like by default, if you just hit the gas pedal on the gameplay, I think the gameplay settings actually kind of steer you and keep you on the road and slow you down. So you could almost just play by holding the gas pedal. Now it tries to keep that subtle, but if you're just holding the gas pedal down, sometimes I can't remember what the setting was on that, but it can do that for you. But since games like Forza do have this really intense capability of driving and handling the physics and understanding how the tires are going to grip the road at different speeds and angles, those are different things that they're going to want people to test and understand how they're driving into it. So if a position is calling that out, I would think that that is very specifically what they need in this. My experience from talking with other game testers has been that's not really been the case. That's actually one of the first times I'm hearing about this. So I think that's more isolated to that specific position, or maybe a few positions that they have along those lines. A lot of places are more interested in your ability to organize a test, to be able to find reproducible steps in something. Honestly, one of the big things about game testing is that it's not just sitting down playing video games, which is kind of how it's made out to be at a couple places. But you will get incredibly bored of the games you play. Because imagine playing whatever game you're excited about, you come in the next day, you're going to play it again, except every data file, every save has been erased. All of that content has been removed. You're back at level 1. And it's not that, and you're testing features where it's like, okay, well, I have to go hit this rock, or I have to go just around and hit like every wall in this point, and I have to do it methodically. There's automation that gets involved in this too. But for the players, a lot of times, like automation can be very difficult to run. So the players are going to be doing all these tasks, or play testers will be doing all these tasks where it's hard to automate, and it's easier to throw a human at it, especially scenarios where we haven't been able to reproduce this bug. We've seen it or we've heard about it, but we have not been able to reproduce it yet. We need to figure out. But that's the biggest thing. They need reproducible steps, and it really helps to have an understanding of programming and the technology leading to things, so that you can say, all right, this seems to be it seems to be maybe a network issue that's causing this. And by understanding the idea that there's content downloading in the background, for instance, you might just literally pull the network plug or have a hotkey that disables the network on your computer. And then all of a sudden you're able to reproduce that, and you can start delivering those steps. That's some of the biggest things that most places looking for testers are looking for. They want someone who can reproduce the scenario and simplify those steps as much as possible. A lot of times the initial repro steps might be able to be cut in half. Oh yeah, and it gets mundane just because you constantly are doing like the exact same thing day in and day out. That being said, it can still be kind of relaxing, kind of fun, but it is a very different mindset than just sitting down to play video games on your own.
Thanks. That's a really great and well-rounded answer. Thank you. And then Will did have a good question, because we are, so myself, Dylan, and then Kristen, if she's here, we are the heads of a game development club that we just started.
Okay.
And so we were interested in possibly hosting like our own game jams, even like on a smaller scale than you would see most of them, but we would like to. Like that's definitely an idea we have in the future. And do you have any advice for that?
Yeah. So one thing is definitely make sure that you can establish a time ahead of time. Like if you want to get more people involved in it, you need to give a heads up. So if are you considering things like this being a weekend game jam, a week, a month? What type of game jam timelines are you considering?
I'm thinking to start off probably a smaller one, so maybe like a weekend one, and then maybe probably advertising for it a good month at least in advance, maybe a little bit longer, to give time for people to properly prepare and stuff for things like that, you know, because we want to, if we're inviting other people outside of just our general school circle, then we're going to be wanting to give proper time for people to be prepared and things like that, so that people can join, you know, as many as they want.
Okay. So the page that I just brought up, if in case you're not already familiar with it, is itch.io/jams. This is a great place to manage and run them. Plus, it just has this huge listing. So at any point in time, you can see where game jams are. I think a weekend one is definitely a good one to start out with. The ones I've done in the past have usually been considerably shorter. There is one that I do that's like a month long. Having a weekend is a good amount of time for people to focus, usually away from work. So that's great. One thing that I would say is for your themes, when you're talking about themes, like what you want to be, it's good to bring in the themes so you kind of help guarantee that people are developing a new project, even if maybe they're redeveloping something to match a theme. But here's a key thing to think about for any types of themes to select. Every keyword in it should have some sense of visualization to its meaning to each role that might jump in. So as a programmer, if you say fast, so if that's the theme, fast, a programmer, you might see things moving quickly. As an artist, you might be imagining wind blowing and the effect of like a motion blur or something like that. For sound, you can certainly have like fast tempos coming in there. One of the key things on that is that it's just that every single keyword that you're throwing in there, it's good to have some sense of visualization. So every person who can potentially be on a team, even if it's kind of established, they all get some sort of visual idea to start off with. And I find that those are some of the best brainstorming sessions or intro sessions where everyone already has ideas they're coming to the table with. Another thing is calling out how it's going to be tested or validated, what the results are. A lot of jams are just like, just post it and share it. And it's just because you did it. That's it. That is your reward. You did it. There are some, actually, here's an interesting one. I haven't even seen this one, but $50,000 game jam build. I have to look at that one for a second. This might be interesting. Overall first prize, 10,000. Functionality, create a game. Crata is the game and world creation oh, got it. So Crata has a game engine, and they want to start getting more people to use it. So they're using game jams as a system. That's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea to actually join them, but most of them don't have any real prizes. As they get larger, you start seeing prizes show up inside of these. But that's also just an expense to figure out like who actually did the best. But yeah, figuring out your rules ahead of time, certainly attending several game jams yourself and playing through them, and including like judging at the end and seeing what the results were. Those are great. It's kind of good to go through that yourself a few times and have someone else as well to kind of pair ideas off of for what you want out of your game jam. And one other thing is, I mean, there are a lot of game jams running at any given point that you can kind of jump into. Now, if you're talking about location wise, like at the college or something, and these are people that you know and have physically met or know online through the class or whatever, that's great. That's a very good reason to create a game jam. Otherwise, a lot of teams that I've seen, like game dev groups I've seen, or I want to call it Meetup. It used to be Meetup was a key thing, but now it's Discord. They'll find game jams to join, and they'll pick a game jam rather than hosting and running their own. Because hosting does take its own time, especially as you get more people and more that you're expecting out of it. So it's kind of great to find an existing one and join in. For instance, one that I usually like to do is 1 month jam, which should be running right now. That's one page, 1 month. I don't know where it is. It would have started on August 1st. 1 minute jam. Anyway, so I'm not seeing it right off the top, but whatever, it's somewhere in there. Yeah, I would say finding, if it's one specifically that you have, if you have a reason to make one stand out from other ones that you can find, then by all means do it. But I would have a good reason why it is, because there's two reasons. Like creating and running a game jam, are you doing it because you want to be in the game jam or because you want to run a game jam? And those are two key differences that can matter, because quite honestly, I've wanted to run them. I have run them before, and I prefer joining in rather than being the manager of it.
Hey, Dan. What were some of the games you worked on earlier in your career, and what was your role in them? And maybe how did that lead to you getting larger roles later on in your career?
Well, I started out a little bit differently than a lot of other game developers, and I'm kind of lucky for that reason. I accidentally fell into higher income on it because of this, because game developers will often make peanuts on the dollar compared to developers for enterprise. So if you're developing websites and apps, you can often make more money. A lot of game companies are struggling to survive. And so they're looking at how do we have funding for like 6 months out, when you have other companies that already have the funding and everything set up for 3 to 5 to 10 to 20 years into the future to make sure that they can generally execute. But game developers are often struggling as well because there are so many people who are excited by the idea of working with video games that it's really a buyer's market out there. So companies can put out a job ad to get a Unity developer, and they might get 1,000 people applying to it. Now, that being said, here's a couple of things that really make that stand out. And I'm going to want you to repeat your question in a second, because I'm sure I'm getting off track on this one.
It's okay.
But if you want to do well in the game dev market in general, you need some features that stand out. I'm going to say that this is one of the key things for employment overall. Programmers are a commodity. You want to take a job and get a job as a programmer, as a game developer, as a QA person, you are a commodity. So you are one person on a shelf next to another person who has similar skills, next to another person who has similar skills, and the companies are just picking who they think it would be the best for the position. You often want to try to get outside of that and have something you can bring to the table that goes beyond that. So being specialized in something, having a YouTube channel where you talk about things, having a book that's written, those are the types of things. I actually had my first game development. I had a book that I had published on AI in Unity, and that was published before I got my first job in game development.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was, and I had already been programming for like 13, 14, maybe 15-ish years. Now, that being said, that was after I worked for Wizards of the Coast. So technically I worked at Wizards of the Coast, but Wizards of the Coast doesn't exactly do video games. I don't know if their rights have changed, but they sold off their rights to Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, for digital gameplay, I believe to Atari. And so Atari was able to create and do all of these games. Wizards of the Coast was not able to write anything that would solve the equations of their work. They could write tools that would help you play, help you design character sheets, for instance, but they couldn't actually solve the math of who would win on the dice rolls. That right was reserved to Atari. I could be wrong on the topic, and I don't know the entire details. And of course, that could have expired or something by now. Anyway, that type of, where was it going with this stuff? I don't really remember now. I started monologuing. Can you ask the original question?
Yeah, it's okay. I get lost too. But I was asking, what was I suppose you mentioned that you've been coding for 14 years beforehand, but I was asking, what was an early game that you worked on in your career, and what was your role in that? And how did that lead to you getting larger roles in the future?
Okay. Actually, I should also caveat this, that the first place that I've worked on an actual video game professionally with a company was GSN Games, and that was like 4 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I've got books published. I speak at Unity. I helped write the Unity certification exam. But there's entirely different ways that you can approach getting into this stuff. So for me personally, I would go out and I would do work like, and this is going to date myself quite well, but back in like 99, I was writing code as a teenager, making video games, figuring out how to write networking tools, and just kind of doing this stuff in like Visual Basic, like VB5. And that was a big challenge. It was a lot of fun. And then I would go off and I would get my first job working with like Visual Basic or websites or something. I don't really remember which. And then I would come home, and the stuff that I'm working on there, as I first started getting into databases, I would take those database technologies home and start working with them and figure out like, what could I do with a video game? How could I make a video game work with this? And I was looking at like MUDs, like multi-user dungeons, where it's just text-based, but you have information being stored. So I certainly spent a long time building up my career before I started diving into this stuff. So For game development, what I brought to the table that was unique to it, aside from having personal experience in game engines, is that I had a huge amount of experience that was literally on professional patterns, professional standards that a lot of the business and enterprise world got to enjoy that game developers tend not to have available. Not to say that there's a lot of particular strengths that game development side history has leading into that as well, where it's like game developers do things in a certain way that business developers would scoff at. And the thing is there's a huge value to both sides in understanding it. And so, and your original question was, how did I get into that? Or what kinds of steps did I take? So for me, it was just, I didn't even really know how to get into it. This was back in like 1999. Game development studios were not as common. I was starting out in Illinois. So central Illinois, surrounded by cornfields, and there is there's nothing out there. If you want a game studio, you're building it yourself. There were a few places and far between, and back then it was C++ that ruled everything for game development, or C. And that was pretty much all that the key stuff was. And I would say that probably over the last maybe 10 years or so, it's really started to change thanks to things like Unity, and just having the compiling engine start to expand out. But I guess there's probably different ways that I could answer that question to be probably a little more valuable. Things that you can do to stand out to help yourself get into the positions. Well, actually, I started to talk about that a little bit. Do you have a different follow-up question with that? Because I feel like I can go into a lot of different directions with this.
Not at the moment. So
Okay.
feel free to go on.
Okay. All right. So one thing is looking at the places that you're in. This is one. Trying to think of where that was going with that. I had a direction, and it's usually an issue with some colleges. One of the reasons that I actually like Renton area tech. But there's a lot of colleges that I have worked with in the past. I've taught at several colleges. Oh yeah, I guess that's actually the first place I started in like 2005. I started teaching game programming at a college. But a lot of colleges are not in touch with the business environment surrounding them. So there are, this was like 15 years ago. But when I was teaching at, where was this? This was in Normal, Central Illinois. I can't even remember the name of the college at this point in time. Heartland Community College. It was a 2-year college. I started teaching game development at that part-time. And a lot of the technology that they were teaching was kind of useless to the immediately surrounding environment. So the businesses that were out there, the primary places that were selling stuff, they didn't have programming positions that matched that type of setup. That's actually something that you'll want to look at. Like, where do you want to live? What companies do you want to work at? What types of games do you want to work on? And then go look at like DICE, go look at Monster, or whatever the major job engines are right now. I guess it would be LinkedIn would probably be the biggest one. But take a look at what places are using, what techs they're actually wanting, and then compare that to what you're learning at college. That should match up pretty well. Now, you might find that it doesn't, and that could be something where a lot of these places, they're starting to use a new engine that's not as common. It's sort of like JavaScript. It's like a lot of places, you take a look at 2 years down the line, and most places will probably be using some new JavaScript engine that sits on top of it, or framework. With some new name on it. And that's what all the places are using. And it takes time for colleges to catch up. But so far, Renton area tech was pretty good at keeping up to date and kind of just talking with developers out in the area to find out what works well. But that's something that you can do for yourself. You can take a look, you can do some of the research to figure out what they're doing. Find other people as well. That's another thing. Start creating connections, getting used to networking. There's a lot of value in knowing people. A lot of the interviews I've gone into, people have already known me going into the interview, which is incredibly helpful. They already know you, they have some recognition of you, how you stand out in the industry or things that you do. And that's really helpful. There's also other tricks to that. One thing is I'm connected to like 20%, or maybe I think it's less now. But yeah, it's less now. Like 3 or 4 years ago, it was like 20% of all of Unity Technologies was connected to me on LinkedIn. But that company has grown significantly, and I think it might be down to like somewhere between 8 and 15% now. But reaching out, making connections on LinkedIn, that's a great way to start it, because now your updates are starting to get out there more. Someone is looking at your resume and it's like, oh, hey, wait, I'm connected to this person on LinkedIn, and they can look you up and see more details. And there's already a connection established. I'm going to stop at that one unless, are there more questions? Or I could keep going.
I have like one more question that's more of just like a related personally to me.
Okay.
So I know you've done hiring and looking at resumes and things like that. What is your experience with people who have criminal backgrounds? I know, odd question.
Yeah, no, I don't have experience with that. And I'm trying to think of what kind of opinions I have. I mean, there's certainly factors like depending on the nature of the crime, but I don't even know if it's what's legal to find out or ask about those types of things. But I would certainly imagine that would affect it. Like someone who stole a bunch of money working at a bank or something, like by forging documents, having them work in a place where we're doing accounting, that would seem like a definite no. So it seems like the nature of the crime would affect it, but I honestly don't know. I don't really want to give opinions on this, primarily just because I mean, people make mistakes. There's things happen, and then you correct your life. And I've known people who have gotten out of prison, corrected their life, and as far as I know, have done everything great and are very responsible. And so I wouldn't also want to have rules out there that say, okay, well, you cannot get back into an area where you've already had expertise because you have proven legally irresponsible in that area or something. I don't know. I haven't had to face that personally. Actually, that's actually one of the things I would bring up on that. That's usually separated out by HR. So HR is going to be doing background checks. They're going to be running things. And if they cancel on someone, they usually don't share that reason why with any of the rest of the hiring team. I have seen messages come down from HR saying, okay, we're not going to be hiring this person. We're not going to be doing any more interviews with them. And without actually giving details why. So that could very well have been the exact reasoning that something like that occurred, but I don't know. I do know that a lot of places like to look at your background, especially since a lot of it is going to be very public. One of the things that can get you is if you write anything negative about a company that you've worked for in the past, other companies look at that and they're worried you'll do the same thing to them. But honestly, I kind of really hate that perspective as well, just because if a company is that worried about it, that they're not willing to hire someone with good skill to do a particular job because they might say something bad about them later, that's also something where it could, like, why did your other developers leave you? Might be another question to ask. So yeah, my apologies, but I can't really give any good answer to that one.
No worries. That was pretty much the answer I was looking for. That's the more of a hard question.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one. I remember earlier on when I was looking at interviews, like this is kind of along those lines. But when I was first studying interviews and interview questions, it's like finding someone who matches the team, who would fit in on the team. I remember that being one of the earlier things. It's like, who would I work well with? And then it changed. It's like as we become more enlightened, I guess, as humans, um, it changed to I need people with differing opinions, with different perspectives, different life experiences coming into this, and really having a completely different set of eyes, while at the same time having a similar technology background to actually support these different ideas. And I find a lot more value in that now.
I definitely agree with the value of diverse opinions. Let's see. I think I have maybe like 2 more questions for you.
Okay.
One is just kind of like a brief like explanation of like different game related jobs. Because there's such a diverse options when you go to try to get into game development. And so it can be hard to understand like what all the different positions are and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'll start that one out with I don't know. um, here's a big explanation of that one. Companies are changing the definition of what it means to be a programmer, developer, designer, senior tech artist, and there's all sorts of different role types, and different companies will establish ones. I remember a lot of times like major companies are kind of setting the trends for this. So you might see like Microsoft and Amazon matching for titles pretty well, or Google. I remember back in like, oh wow, this might be like 2001 territory, 2000. But I remember working with another developer a tester who came from IBM, and they knew exactly what a tester did, what their role title meant. But the thing is that didn't work within the company that we were at. So they had come from IBM with like 7 years of experience working there as some form of a testing role. And they were not getting things done because they were expecting certain things to be handed to them that were just, no, it's a smaller company. The roles are much more blurred. And then the company and the projects and the team start to kind of define what those are. I remember I was at Wizards of the Coast and I actually helped them write the standards for what they expected from a senior QA person. That's what I was doing with them at the time. I was doing senior QA, and I was also teaching some courses inside to other developers. Oh yeah, so it changes. The big thing is like you can kind of look at the title to give yourself ideas of what things are. So I mean, like an artist, a tech artist, for instance, is going to be someone who is likely going to know shader knowledge. They're going to understand that gap that is between the art world, where it's very creatively minded, and the technical world, understanding things like, when I'm going to iOS, I want my image sizes to default to 2048 because it's going to use a memory block of that size, or understanding different things around those natures. But then here's a big thing to understand. You're not, when they put those job ads out there, most of the places that put them, they aren't going to describe what your position is. You are jumping into a team, and every person they look at is going to have a different set of skills on how they fill that void that they're trying to either create a new position, expand, or just fill something where somebody left. And you want to, you want to be able to look at that, like, what does this team need? It's great if they can include information like you will be joining a team of 6 other developers, a designer, and a QA person, and a producer. Because telling you things like that, you're getting the idea of, oh, their team already has skills in these areas. And it's great to figure out where you can expand in areas and understand that you have strengths. You're not going to fill in every challenge that they have, and that's okay. Most places are not looking for someone to fill in every single thing, even on the required list. A lot of times the required list is still guesses, where it's like, oh, well, yeah, this was required, but this person is pretty weak in shaders, but they can do all this stuff. So let's get them in anyway. And this other person on our team has shader knowledge and they can still do a lot of this stuff, but this other thing is much more valuable to what our team is doing. Do you have a follow-up question on that one?
Not a follow-up question. I just have one more question that's not really related to anything we've talked about yet.
That's okay.
So I have a good friend of mine who is colorblind, like particularly colorblind. And he loves to play video games, but some video games are very hard for him to play, especially color-based games. So what is your take on accessibility, especially surrounding colorblindness support in video games?
I think it's a major thing. I understand, like, first off, when a team is developing something, especially if you're talking about like an indie team, and that's what a lot of these games out there are being built off of, that it's an indie team that kind of starts to just expand and then maybe get bought out by another place. They're building at first to get something out the door and done. That's usually the biggest concern of most places trying to survive. So their first concern is what's going to make the biggest impact. But honestly, for things like color blindness, there are filters that you can get from most any game engine that you can run, or even that it's like a part of Windows or Mac, and you just change the color scheme. So you are literally limited. Now, so you can run your game on occasion, or at least have testers who are taking a look at this. That's another great way to do it. But taking a look at this and getting opinions, seeing what it's like, do things actually make sense? Like, do you have a command in there that says, hit the green button to continue? I remember probably around, I think it was like maybe 2009 to 2012-ish is when I started seeing more companies do that more seriously. But that also that could just be the companies that I was at. But that started becoming more of a normal thing. But again, yeah, places are going to try to first hit like that. What is their biggest demographic? What is their biggest market? And then try to make it more expanded. And a lot of times things like visibility or like color blindness is going to be a concern that comes in around the same time as translations for moving into additional markets. And it's not something that's worked into the art to begin with. It's not something that's worked into the feel or the flow of the game. And like you mentioned, with games that work with colors in specific, that they don't have color option or colorblind options. Like, okay, this one, instead of being red and green and blue, it is striped and solid and squares. So a lot of places have options. But a lot of the teams going into it, I know, are not considering that as much, at least not for initial launch. And then what kind of sucks in business is that the places are built to make money. I mean, you have the indie teams who are just building this because that's what they love to do. And then they're restricted by resources and even having the experience to consider checking for that. But then you also have these business decisions happening all the time that are just like, okay, yeah, these typos, we're not going to bother getting those corrected. We want to focus on this thing that's going to have more sales for us, or this is going to have more user growth. Those are the things we need you to focus on. We need to get that out the door by such and such time. And everything is all these short deadlines and timestamps and just getting these things done. And So a lot of things like color blindness are going to be out, where it's like that's one of the last considerations. It's like, how can we improve it for that? Yeah. I hate to say it, but most places don't. When you're talking about places like Microsoft, on the other hand, that are big enough and large enough, they have standards built in where it's just like, okay, make sure that when you're doing this, that we have alternative tracks of being able to control the system. Not everything inside the company actually follows their own rules and guidelines, but sometimes they are importing projects and tools that they actually bought from other people or from other companies. And so those are like afterthoughts in those ones. But yeah, I've seen that a lot of times, and I think it is something where companies do need to consider that. I really wish Unity actually had built-in features for it. Like, hey, click this and you can change your game display view to show what the different color palettes are for when you're colorblind. Or here's an idea of a blind system. So actually you could just, I guess, not have any visuals, not have any camera. I have seen games where I have heard of games where it's for people who are literally blind, or you're just literally not using visuals at all as well. And so I think that's another thing where developers, it would really be valuable to most developers to understand that, to take a look into how you could approach color blindness. How could you approach your application potentially solving problems for a blind person? And just include that as like minor brainstorms along the way. And there are other handicaps as well, like for instance, maybe not even being able to use a mouse. You can consider it in a couple different ways. One is you might be supporting systems, or might want your application to run on systems that literally don't have a mouse to interface with. So you wanted to operate on touch screens as well, or make sure that you have keyboard keys that can react and respond to everything. There's a lot of different things about that, but the reason why you don't see that in a lot of games is just because it's either not really considered. It's a starting team, they're being pushed, there's timelines, and that's one of the last things that they're considering, or they haven't even thought of it. I remember what probably wasn't until 2009 to 2012-ish, like when I was already a decade into programming professionally, where that really started to enter my mind. Of course, before then, most of the things that I was doing were like WinForms, basic WinForms, web forms, where colors really weren't a big deal of separation. We had contrast that was a strong enough thing. So it could have also been the nature of the spaces that I was entering where places were considering that more.
Okay, yeah, that was actually really great. Thank you so much for that. To follow up on that, then, do you think that it may be a worthwhile investment for someone to come up with maybe just a program that can run alongside or on a computer? I know there probably is some, and I have definitely, like, in conversations with my friend, he has definitely tried out like the one that Windows offers, just like on the operating system and things like that. He has tried those, and but generally the problem is that in color blindness, there are varying degrees of it, and there are also, some people can see certain colors better while other people just have an issue with certain colors. So it changes from person to person. And so I've played around with the idea of creating a program that just allows you to basically lay over whatever the person is looking at and then allow them to adjust the colors to what they need.
Oh, I like that. This is an area where I don't know enough about. I remember looking at colorblind issues on HoloLens apps before. Seeing like what it would take to make sure that some of the apps were actually fitting in contrast and everything for that. But I hadn't considered the idea of actually a color shift. That seems like a particularly good idea. And I haven't worked with that on any of the applications. So let's see if I go down to here. I know that there's already stuff inside of Windows that might just be, nope, not what I'm looking for. I need display settings. Like you can choose color palettes, and I'm not sure how that works or if that's something that you can actually apply to get, oh, color profile. Just the way colors, I don't know how that works or if that's something that helps. But I kind of feel like that might be a good thing to look into. Yeah, I don't know the answer, but I think that would be an awesome thing to add. It does sound like there might already be tools out there, so I'd recommend taking a look into what's already there and seeing if there's still value in creating something else for the market.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think that's pretty much it for my questions. Does anybody else have any?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, David. Please go right ahead.
Yeah. So then, so what I've gathered is that you've been in the field for an incredibly long time. Like you started back in like the 2010s, right?
1999.
1999, yeah. So do you think that the field for people trying to get their first job is a lot different now than versus then, like around
Yes.
like 2010 eras?
Yes, definitely. One is that there's already a huge way to track people. So if I wanted to look someone up on the internet, all of a sudden I have their Facebook profile, I have their Twitter profile. Companies are much more apt to look at these types of things to see people. Now, at the same time, when you are in a junior position, they don't care as much about your history on the internet, all these things happening. It's usually not until you get into more senior positions where your name might have more impact and meaning if you were to say something negative about a company.
Right. So what kind of tools like what kind of tools and like what kind of information do companies use to look you up?
LinkedIn is going to be one of the first places. I've actually gotten jobs and introductions from people who have never met me because they or had seen my resume just because of the fact that they saw my responses on posts on LinkedIn. So when there's topics and conversation going on about the nature of QA testing and automation or on game development patterns, saying something intelligent, saying something meaningful that might change the direction of a conversation can have a huge amount of impact, because you always have recruiters now that are looking at these tools that they don't know game development, but they can tell when someone says something because they're also reading the follow-up feedback. It's like, what are other people saying about what you said? And it's like, are there parts of the conversation that stand out? Who are the people who said it? Okay, take a look at their profile. What things do they have in their background? Okay, this is the type of thing. Another thing is that people who are just starting out, or I guess this is probably changing. When I was starting out, no one knew what other people made. That was a big lockdown secret, that it's like we didn't have glassdoor.com or anything like that to kind of try looking it up. And honestly, places like Glassdoor, I have found almost never match the type of numbers things can actually be. That people are usually only posting bad experiences on Glassdoor. And so a lot of times you might also have developers. You can certainly have someone posting onto glassdoor.com who is a very good, great developer, excellent at what they do, but had a bad experience. But you can also have a lot of people that just find one bad experience after another, and it tends to be them, and their price position never moves up. And so, yeah, the senior dev in this area is making $90,000 a year. And a senior dev in like Seattle area making under 100K seems pretty poor. And that can also happen. I'm going to tell you one thing that happened to me when I was starting out was I had already been working for like maybe 5-6 years, and I was doing pretty well, but I was making like $15 an hour. Now, consider that back then minimum wage was like $5 an hour or $6 an hour or something. And again, didn't have a lot of knowledge of this type of stuff being shared around. But I had the guts to ask for $15 an hour at one company back in like 1999, and they're like, okay, yes, we'll do it. And then for the next 5 years, that's what I asked for. And I had this one interview that I went to where they had told me we got to the end of the interview and they asked, okay, how much do you want? And I said 15 an hour. And they said, if you had told us that at the beginning, we wouldn't have gotten this interview. We're going to pay you $35 an hour or 33. I don't remember which one.
Oh, dear Lord.
Yeah. And I'm like, wait, what? And they said, well, clearly you have the experience of someone who is $35 an hour. And we don't want someone else taking you away from us, making you an offer to move over to them and that you'll just take it. That if you are asking a place that to be a $15 an hour programmer, places will pay you $15 an hour to program. If you ask for 30 an hour, they will do that. If you ask for $100 an hour, $150 an hour, they will do that. But every time that you're going up in these rungs, they're expecting a different approach. Like in my interviews, I almost never get asked programming questions anymore. That has changed. So as junior level developers, that's going to be the majority of what you're going to be asked. You're going to be asked, how do you format a list or sort a list? Can you write some code to the console or something? Can you write the basic HTML skeleton document? They're going to be asking questions along those lines. But as your skill level goes up, even if you're doing the same type of job, your skill level is going to go up, and you obviously have more to bring to the table. And recognizing those price differences goes a long way. Because if you ask for $15 an hour positions, you will be given $15 an hour positions, and you won't have any power at a company. You won't be able to make decisions to change the directions of products because you are going to be lower level. And it's recognizing that those other things actually are there, that they exist, that there are positions beyond a senior developer, beyond an architect, where you can still be programming and still be making huge amounts of money in comparison. Which I think I did get a little off track of what the original question was, because I don't remember it anymore. I do that a lot.
I believe the original question was, is the job industry different nowadays from when you first got in and finding the first job to get in there? And I like the answer. I do believe you did answer it.
Yeah, so what I'm getting is that to get your first job, just ask for a $15 position.
Yeah, if you're willing to work for peanuts, places will pay you peanuts. And if you can show that you have some real experience, like, to be honest, Renton Area Technical, the way that they've approached things, or that I've seen how they approach things, because I haven't actually attended there, was that it's more like help you find your path through it, not necessarily here is the archaic technology that we are basing our courses off of from 10 years ago. That I have seen way too many colleges depend on. So you're actually you're tending to stay up to date on this and really getting into real problems that current places face and have to struggle with. So when you actually go into an interview and they're asking you these first low level questions about how do you program this, how do you do that, you've really done this. It wasn't just like some element of a book that you kind of pushed through that was from a decade ago.
Yeah.
More questions?
I had a question. So earlier you talked about how game development professionally, you're often working on things that are more focused on like getting new users or like other things to benefit the game. Do you feel like general experience around a game is more valuable in a professional setting than like genre passion that usually seems to drive the indie side of game development?
I'm having a little trouble following that question.
Uh,
So you're talking about, you're asking about if you're interested in a particular game, like a specific video game, like as a player, or as a specific game style to program or something?
yeah, game styles. Like if you were very into a real-time strategy kind of game and you went to work professionally, um, like if it was a real-time strategy game that you were helping develop, would it be most valuable to have that like passion for that genre, or more valuable to have the general game development experience from multiple different genres and professional work?
That's a good question. There certainly is a lot of value. Like places will want to hire a been there, done that type of person. If you can show that I've already built systems that work for this, I've already built tech trees, I've already built the mapping systems and the AI systems for how those systems play, that goes a long way. But what I'm finding a lot of places want is they want people with a lot of varying experience, especially as you get more powerful into a position. So as you're more junior, pretty much anything will kind of can get you in the door, but you're competing against a bunch of other people who are presenting anything. Like mid-level, kind of senior levels are areas where I think it really starts to stand out more. But starting to get in for your first positions, yes, like anything you can bring to the door is going to be good. I think a been there, done that type of person is going to stand out more at entry level positions, which is kind of backwards because it's entry level. But if you can show that you've actually done the specific things that they're asking for, even if it's not the same way or same approach they would take, that you have logically been thinking through this, you understand how these work. And that means that even if we have new patterns, we could be teaching you those patterns. You would be able to understand the value of like why these ones are better. That being said, what a lot of places, and I think this might also be something that is different between junior, mid, and senior level developers. More places have been asking about specific understanding of frameworks like Solid, for instance. So like single responsibility principle, that you make small classes that are focused on one thing, or that you're using interface segregation. So you start to split out purposes into interfaces. Understanding the values of those types of things are some of the areas that really stand out. However, that I have to say is one of the things that I think most places don't necessarily expect you to understand as a junior developer coming in. They're expecting their senior level developers to be kind of shaping how things are supposed to run. And as a junior person, they're wanting to see that you've probably tried a variety. I'm working my way in circles here. So yeah, if you've already been there, done that, that helps. But when you are junior level, it also helps the other way if you have a variety of different systems that you've worked with. And by systems, I mean systems of programming. So worked with understanding single responsibility, understanding observable, understanding, just forgot some of the terms for these, but flyweight pattern, or there's a lot of different types of patterns to programming, and having an understanding of them, I think, can help out a lot. I will also say this, that when you're in the interview, a lot of times they're not going to be asking questions along those lines. They're going to be asking questions about specific programming things like, can you program this? They want to know that you can program if you're coming in as a coder. And it leaves it up to you to try to lead a little bit more of the conversation. It's like, oh yeah, I've done this. I actually did that with a sample RTS I was building before, where we did this, and this was the approach that I used on this particular one. When you add those extra keywords in during your interviews, it helps suddenly increase the bar of where you stand. So now it's like, oh yeah, so you've done this, you know how to do the programming part of it, you're showing us how, but you're also explaining that connection it has to gaming. It's not just that you learned this in a programming course. You've actually tried this. You've tried something similar. You've approached it in a similar environment to the problems we're facing as a company. And that can go a long way. So specific areas, a lot of companies, there's no exact right answer, I should say this. But a lot of companies they're kind of pigeonholed into particular areas. So when you think of Turn 10 Studios, you're probably going to be thinking of racing games. There's studios that get defined by a particular genre. And so if you want to get a position there, if you have only worked in that type, if you only have experience in racing games, in creating samples of the physics with it or developing menus for it, those are the types that would be fine. But there are other game ones, especially when you're talking about like King or GSN Games or other studios that are kind of spread out. They end up having lots of different game genres that they're jumping into. And so with those ones, having a huge genre might stand out better. So it really kind of depends on where you're going. But that being said, it's very seldom that having a lot of experience in one area is going to stop you from getting a position that focuses on a slightly different area, because so much of the game tech carries over, so much of the programming, so much of the concepts. You usually end up having, it's like DNA differences between humans and what was it, fleas or something. It's like there's a 2% difference between our DNA. And so same thing with programming. You're programming a game and it's like, yes, you need menus. Yes, you need interaction systems. Yes, you need a way to store the player data. Yes, you need this. There's so many pieces of overlap between almost any genre that a game developer in one section will be able to thrive in other sections as well.
To follow, oh, sorry, Zach, you can continue in a second. I just wanted to say, to follow up, and maybe you can expand upon this. I put a link for a webpage called gameprogrammingpatterns.com that is, I find, really useful, and actually has it's free online and has a lot of those patterns that you were just discussing. So maybe after Zach follows up, you can talk a little bit more how one could go about implementing them and their importance in both game design and talking about it in the industry.
Okay. Yeah, with the actually, I'll need you first off, Zach, do you have more follow-up questions?
I do not. I very much enjoyed that answer. Thank you.
Okay. William, you were talking about patterns and asking about that, or what were you saying about that?
Yes. So in the chat, I put a link for gameprogrammingpatterns.com. And you'll see that it actually has a lot of the patterns you listed, like the observer and things like that. So if you want to go over a little bit of those, explain how they're not necessarily like how they're implemented, but what they do, and then also how they can bring what they can bring to a conversation in an interview, being like, I understand this and I used it for that and whatnot.
Yeah, listing off these different types of patterns on your resume is probably more valuable than listing, well, maybe more valuable than listing a variety of languages that you've worked with. So for instance, I have it up on my screen right now. There's a bunch of different ones in here, and I'm probably going to mess up a little bit on it, but like state is state machine, singletons, that's a common one. Observer, those are ones I commonly use. Command pattern, if I'm remembering right, this one is great when you need a system that can do undos, where every command it has, let's see, was that actually the one? It should have do this command, but then also how to undo it, which was the big thing for why it works well with undo. Oh yeah, calling out undo and redo on this one. So there's different reasons why you would pull in different patterns. Like if you want a system that can do undo, command pattern that's kind of your go-to. You go to command pattern as your default because you store a sequence of the commands that happen. And then every time you execute a command, you also include that information of how do you go backwards. So that's incredibly valuable in that system, and it's just built in. And one of the big problems is almost every other one of these doesn't really support undo. So that's actually kind of a feature technology. But when you're talking about video games, undo is usually not that important. And there are other ways. Like, for instance, if it's a game of chess or something, you can literally just have a copy of what every board was beforehand, because you have you can just save it in a shorthand line for what that one was. And it's very easy to put all the pieces back. Okay, flyweight. Oh God, what was this one? Fogless, blah, 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 forest. Okay, I remember the flyweight pattern. I think this follows a little bit more dot. I haven't used it in a while, so I don't want to comment on it. Observer has been my go-to pattern for a while now. I started going through a variety of these. I did incredibly strong, solid-based programming in Unity, and I no longer really recommend that one. I understand it, but there's challenges and difficulties within it, and solid is also a little too vague, and people trying to find absolution in it tend to work their way into circles, just trying to figure out, okay, I need to make this work this way and get that to work this way. So they end up struggling to make their systems fit solid in a lot of cases. It has its purposes. But observer, the basic idea of observer is that normally when you have different classes that are talking, you have one class know about that other class. It literally directly references that other class, and now it can change the variables. It can call the methods inside it. An observer changes that, where now I have a variable that is an object. It's just holding on to an integer or a string. And now when something else wants to know about it, I pass the reference of that over. So now this other thing doesn't need to know how other classes in my system works. It only needs to know the data and the methods it needs. And so it's kind of like object oriented, except it's data specific. That one I have found incredibly valuable inside of Unity in particular. So that's one that I call out. Now, that's also a big thing. When you're going into different engines, it changes. Sometimes a different engine is going to require other things. A huge amount of what's in Unity, like what comes with it, is already singleton. Singleton is the nature that you can just type in the name of the class that you want, and you hit dot, and then you get the command or the variables that you need, and it's just there. Which is great when you're talking about getting, what are the dimensions of the screen? How many pixels across is it? Where is it located on the screen? Those are good things to know. Or what is the sound volume or something like that. But there's dangers to each of these as well. Singletons, for instance, because it's statically available, often makes testing a nightmare, because you already have, you're holding on to state data, things that influence the nature of the program, but you can't simulate what's static. That you typically need things that are interfaces. Now, there are ways to do static-based singletons, and so if you understand the differences of how singletons work by default and how you can make them work better for testing, then you can solve the different types of problems. But that's good to go through these and understand them. Now, I will also say that in my opinion, it might be better to go look up YouTube videos on the specific patterns, but having it in a list right here is great, where you can just see a list and there it is. And now you can go look up a video on this particular one, but it kind of depends on the medium that you want to follow. For me, I think it also depends. If you have enough programming experience, then watching like a 5-minute video where they just kind of talk about how it works is great. Otherwise, then you probably actually need to go try it. Most of these, I am a person who, I did not go to college. So I learned pretty much everything on my own. And so most of these commands I have ended up generating and finding my way into the architecture just because it seemed like the right solution. And then later finding out that this is actually a named thing. And I mean, that's not particularly special. I don't want to make it sound like that. I end up reinventing the wheel a lot in my personal development. And then I end up understanding how command works at a very deep level, how singleton, observer, etc. They're kind of based off of basic principles we learn in the coding, and then we use them as solutions and then find out that they actually have specific values. And if you learn how the different patterns work, then you can understand the strengths and values and understand better if it's going to solve the problems that you need. So a lot of places, like if you know more types of these, that can stand out. But I will also say this. some of the places that you work for, some of the people that will be interviewing you, they aren't going to be familiar with these. They're not going to have names for these ones either. So the fact that you're presenting that you have worked with 7 different ones isn't going to mean very much to them. And it's not to say that there's anything bad about that. It was probably 15 years into programming before I started looking at the names of the different patterns I was using. So I had 15 years of experience operating basically what a lot of were like state machines and singletons. But I didn't know the name of it. I actually failed an interview because they asked me, can I tell them how to concatenate a string? And I had never even heard the word concatenate before, but that is literally add a string. So add strings together, put the little plus or the and sign in between the 2 strings, and now they're concatenated. And during an interview, I said, no, I don't know how to do that. Anyway, so yeah, the update, that's another thing, like the game loop, the update method, those are things that are common to game engines because they have a constant frame rate that they're trying to keep up. But you can maintain, there are other ways to do this, especially when you're talking about a lot of the casual games where it's like nothing is actually happening on the screen for the most of the time until you actually click something, and then it has a little sequence or animation. Let's see, subclass sandbox, type object, component. Component is also Unity as well. Event queue, service locator. Service locator is another great one. Service locator, there's another one called dependency injection. Dependency injection, I could give reasons why I don't like dependency injection anymore, and some of the rules that play for reasons why places pull it in. But it's good to know. A lot of places are starting to rely on dependency injection and considering service locator to be a negative thing. But the reasons that most places actually choose dependency injection are things that they will never face as a company, as a program. They will never face the challenges that it actually is trying to solve for them. Reasons why they're saying not to use a service locator, for instance, and use dependency injection. And it actually costs a little bit more on resources. But the reasons for it, when you actually are going to use it, are actually pretty powerful. You can actually change a dependency injection system without any of the classes, without changing any of your class code, which is pretty incredible, but no place has ever used that. I have never seen a place actually to change out their dependency injection engine. And that by that point, if you're not going to change it out or need that to be flexible, then service locator is perfect. And it's a lot lighter. Yeah. So, dirty flag. There's so much stuff in here. Oh, object pooling. I'll bring up object pooling in this. That's most of your games, when you're writing video games, it is best when your system starts if it already knows everything that is going to be on the screen. So if you've got a star field, if you've got enemies, you know that there are going to be no more than 20 of a particular type of enemy on the screen at any given time in the game. When the game starts up, you create 20 of them. So your initial loading, when everything is just getting set, you've got 20 of them. They're hidden away. They're not doing anything, but they're already loaded into memory. And now you just recycle through them. Your object pool is what's holding onto those references, and it keeps them hidden. And then when you need it, it's just, reactivate it. So it's already there. It's in memory. You don't have to start allocating new memory. If you can cut out all memory allocation from your game, that is going to give you an incredible boost to performance. That's actually one of the hardest things, like allocating memory, getting the new pieces of the application in there, a new enemy that comes in with 40 other enemies behind it. Loading all of those enemies. I have seen games countless times where they just delete all the objects and recreate them because they have a new structure for how it's going to be set up, but they already had a bunch of them, and they could save a huge amount of time on level loading by just even to the point of keeping everything down to a single frame. So a user never even notices a level load just because it's already all there. So object pooling is a great one. Spatial partition, I don't know that name. That makes me want to look at that. Like pretty much everything on here I at least recognize if it's not something that I regularly use. But yeah, I definitely think this is a great place to dive into. I think in most positions, understanding these ones and just run an experiment, try creating an app, a small, simple test that actually uses each one of these, and just to see what it's like, what its values are, so you can personally speak to it. And that is a huge practice. That is a huge gain, just to kind of figure out what you can do with it. For the same reason that when you start jumping onto a program and someone suggests, oh, we should use a flyweight pattern for this or observable pattern for this, but you know it needs an undo feature, and you know that observable doesn't by default support undos, and it usually can be difficult to add it. Command pattern is exactly what you want to use. It's just built into the nature of how that one works.
That's perfect. And yeah, we it isn't really until we start hitting the BAS where we start to talk design patterns, but that doesn't mean that that conversation can't start earlier. One of the things I like to enforce to students is you don't need to wait for us to start introducing the material. Go ahead, start looking into it, start getting those discussions going. So this seems like it'd be a really good resource to start diving into those design patterns. It's better to start being comfortable talking about it than going in and being like, all right, now you're going to be graded on this. Yeah.
And one thing I'll add to that is, which I alluded to a little bit, you are already using some of these patterns in your programming. If you are more than about like 6 weeks into programming, you are already using some of these patterns inside of the code that you're doing. It's like unavoidable. As soon as you got a second class, you're definitely using some kind of pattern from here. So understanding the names and what those mean, like the reason these ones are well known is because of the fact that they have worked. They have proven valuable. They have systems where we know that they work well in. And so rather than having to invent everything, rather than to have to create an entire application and suddenly take a step back and go, oh, I really wish I didn't program it like that. Why did I put those variables in this structure? Why do I have to reach out to it? Because I can't get to it from this point in the application without like redoing all this other stuff. And it's like all these nightmare points where if you understood how the patterns worked, you would understand the value of what you're building into the code and realizing that, oh, well, the application is also supposed to do this in 2 months, that we know this is supposed to be part of it or the nature of where it's headed. We really need to make sure we're accounting for that type of pattern in our code, that we'll be able to access it that way later. And that's really valuable to know.
Wonderful. To kind of a tangent onto that, you mentioned like create these small bite-sized chunks to really play around with all these projects. I find projects are one of the strongest parts of my repertoire, and as with you too, we build our projects. This is how we learn about things. How do you go about creating a project? Where do you start at when you create a project? Is it based on an idea you have or something you want to discover and explore? And how can students really start to work on that? And also, this is kind of piggybacking onto your call out to your YouTube channel and your amazing devlogs, documenting that process, so that way in the future you can have deeper conversations about the things you've learned, and also be able to show it to people who would be interested in hiring on our brilliant students.
Let me see if I can find something in here. I have lots of items inside of this. Was that one that I wanted? Rock builder. No, it's nope. So one of the things, first off, for me, it's always been follow my passion. So if I have an interest in a particular game, that there's one that I'm playing on the phone for like the last month and it's been intriguing me, a lot of my game design will invariably start to shift towards it. So I want to find a specific example. It would be back a little bit farther. No, leave that one out. Proof of concepts. Nope. Actually, that might be a great thing. I am going to share a banana bread recipe to explain this game development element.
Accepted.
Okay. So this is a banana bread recipe that I've been working on for a while that I really love the flavor of. However, every time that I make it, I end up either having some mistake that I understand that I made, or I specifically decided to change something. So in the past, you can see I have different revisions of this. Like, so in 2019, I made this and I did not add salt this time. Update recipe to include half a teaspoon of salt. We think it might need 1 teaspoon, but we will up this slowly. No one needs a salty banana log. And then I'm commenting what worked well. So I have this initial plan, this idea of what I was doing, even if it was entirely ad hoc, even if I'm following a scheme that I found online somewhere. It's great to start writing down ideas of the areas that you are experimenting with in particular. And then figure out what went well, discuss it, what went well, what did not go well. It's the retrospective. And then put that in there. Same thing when I was doing a lot of tech art things, which, let's see, I don't want to share that one. Not cross products, no. Controllers, dry erase whiteboard app. Oh, I can't find what I was looking for. RTS building construction. That was one of the ones. This one, I went through a lot of iterations of figuring out how to make objects transition from one type of object into another, and experimenting with how that would work. And then as I did it, I would theorize what might work better, how could I improve this, and then go experiment with it. And I would have screenshots. I'm saving screenshots of how one thing converts to another, even some of the simple instructions as I was learning blend shapes in Unity, in Blender, which, thank you, William. William is a person who taught me that one. And then I took that and ran and basically recreated blend shapes inside of Unity directly. So I could actually have structures that would reform how I wanted to it. So it would basically look like transformers. A box turns into a building, or unfolds into it. So we see like different things, like this cube is actually what animated and turned into this thing. We see everything just kind of pop out and slide out. But as I was doing this, I was writing down my notes, taking the screenshots, and those screenshots, those are my thumbnails. Those are things that are starting to build out what I can experiment or talk about later. If I know I'm going into an interview where they're going to be talking about some sort of dynamic tech art where they're going to transform objects into other objects, I have things that I can pull up for that. Plus, I'm just organizing it. It's a great way to kind of look through it and go, okay, well, I'm probably going to do this again. I want to remember how I did this. And I also want to rethink, what can I do better? And that is a great way. You write down notes. It's like, we can see the object matches. Now we should save it, build it, blah, blah, blah. Now we have this, but we have no texture. We have to set this. And so as I was following tutorials, I was filling out this one. Transformations, shape keys allow. Base key 1. Okay, so I was calling out bugs, special notes, separate segments. Okay, yeah, so at this point, by the time that I was getting to here, I was getting out of just the structural knowledge of how to do something and getting into the art side. That's a really valuable thing to understand, that you could create some of the most incredible code, incredible technology ever created. But if people can't see why that's interesting, then it's not going to stand out. They're going to pick someone else or pick some inferior programming system or solution because the visuals spoke to them better. So being able to present how things transition, that is all incredibly important. Anyway, so I can't really call that out in specific, like exact things of which documents to pull up. I wasn't expecting that one. But I'll leave that one there. And actually, I do have to get going. So I could take one more question and then I'm going to have to take off.
I'm good. Does anyone have any last questions for Dan?
What game did you work on that you're the most proud of?
RTS 21. It was never finished. Oh, actually, Warp Wars. Warp Wars was also never finished. That was my gateway into Unity.
Real quick follow-up question. Is there anything like on Steam that you've worked on that we could take a look at? Or that I know?
I'm working at their GSN game. Oh, well, it's not on Steam, but it's on mobile. GSN games Tri-Peak Solitaire. It's the, I don't know, that thing makes like, I don't know the exact amount, but I think it's somewhere close to like $500 million a year for that one video game. I don't
But
get
it's
to
not
see
on
that.
Steam.
No, just on mobile. Warp Wars, videos, images. That was not it. Oh, there it is. Oh, I don't have that anymore. Okay. The site finally died. Yeah, Warp Wars, it started out as this kind of really cheesy thing where it was just animated and we were creating it piece by piece, but it was my first introduction. I was actually I wrote code that was procedurally setting like all the triangles that were being shown, that were showing up. I had done game engines before this, and this was my first introduction to Unity, and I made some bad, terrible choices in its design. But eventually we started getting things where we could fly dragons around, build stuff. We had cities. I had like 10,000 tiles being updated in real time by a procedural engine. And it would actually build entire cities with streets that had multiple like neighborhoods in them. And it would completely design that at runtime. So it would just, in the middle of runtime, under a single frame, it would all of a sudden just rewrite the entire cities of everything around it. And there you would have navigatable paths through everything. Transitions, animated water. It was a lot of fun. But that one ended up dying out. My house actually burned down, and then I didn't get back to the project for 3 months, and I had people from all over the world who were joining in on this one, but it kind of fell apart well, my stuff did. Anyway, but that's it.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Dan.
All right. Yeah, I'll talk to you guys later.